Okay, colleagues, so next we're going to talk about the Stoics. So unfortunately, there's absolutely no time to go into any detail. So as always, I invite you to do your own reading. For our purposes, the most important idea that we get from the Stoics is the notion of natural law. Natural law. Very important idea in the history of Western political philosophy. In many ways, for the first time, clearly introduced and clearly expressed only in the philosophy of Stoics. So, Stoicism existed for many centuries. It was founded, the Stoics were younger contemporaries of Epicurus and of Aristotle, but Stoicism as a philosophy persisted into the Roman period and actually became very popular in the Roman period for reasons which may or may not be apparent in a second. So in general, the Stoics, as well as other Hellenistic schools, emphasized this notion of ataraxia, happiness through ataraxia, happiness through freedom from disturbance. Again, this calmness, serenity. One becomes happy, not through satisfaction of desire, but through gaining control over one's desire. And reason and rationality played a very important part in the Stoic doctrine. Again, in many ways, the Stoics regarded Socrates as one of their forefathers, and the Socratic doctrine that nobody does wrong willingly, no one does wrong willingly, and in fact, that the key to virtue, to goodness, human excellence, is reason, this intellectualism about virtue is a very important part of the Stoic doctrine. And so more specifically, through the power of the intellect, through understanding the human nature and the human place in the cosmos, through this subordination of desire to reason, one was supposed to be able to achieve this ataraxia, perfect tranquility, perfect calmness. Now, there is an interesting and actually a problematic question about the relationship of virtue to happiness. Again, virtue, the Greek word is arete, could also be translated as excellence. In the context of the Stoics, especially later Roman Stoics, the Stoic definition of virtue is going to be fairly traditional. So basically, whatever the Roman society considers to be virtuous in line with the traditions of the forefathers. And the notion was that virtue is sufficient for happiness. Virtue is enough to ensure a happy life. So this is kind of already an interesting issue, a bit of a departure from what we have seen in Plato, in Aristotle, and also in Epicurus. So Plato, Aristotle, and Epicurus would say that the person, that happiness is the goal of life. That happiness is the goal of life. And that virtue or excellence of character, an excellent human life, ensures happiness. Excellent human life ensures happiness. Stoics have this interesting way of speaking where they say that, no, virtue is sufficient for happiness. Virtue is sufficient for happiness. And this is actually a potential tension within their philosophy. So I have mentioned, this is a very important notion, I have mentioned already immanent versus transcendent criterion of goodness. Again, the word good by itself does not mean anything, right? We need to define the word good. And different philosophies will have radically different definitions of the word good. I mean, think of Callicles or Thrasymachus, this pleonexic pursuit of desire. If Callicles presumably would consider that to be the end of human life and the essence of human goodness, right? So different philosophical schools will have radically different definitions of goodness, right? And again, the notion is, how do you know what is good? How do you know what is good? Is the criterion of goodness, is it immanent in your soul, in your psyche? Is it internal to you, to the agent? As presumably it was in Plato and in Aristotle. If you lead a good life, you should feel from the inside. You should feel happiness or pleasure maybe is not the end of life, but it is a dividend of virtue. Dividend, right? So you understand that you are leading a good life because you feel from within your life to be harmonious. Remember, for Plato and Aristotle, the word harmony, internal harmony is very important, right? And you can feel internal harmony, right? It is an harmony of the soul. You can feel it from within. Contrast this to some kind of external or transcendent criterion. External or transcendent criterion, which just says, let's say, the gods tell you what to do. And it doesn't matter what you feel, right? You should obey the gods. And on the transcendent criterion, it is possible to be miserable, to be deeply unhappy, right? And yet to do the right thing, right? So this possibility of attention, right? And I want to say that to the extent that the Stoics emphasize internal psychological harmony, and again, this ataraxia, they appeal to the immanent criterion. But also, in addition to this, and this is where we come to the doctrine of the natural law, the Stoics, in addition to this immanent criterion, will also appeal to some kind of universal or transcendent criterion, in a fashion which is broadly speaking reminiscent of Aristotle. However, although the Stoics are actually much more radical than Aristotle in this way, the Stoics are going to say that this world is providentially governed. It is a deeply rational and orderly place. In fact, this world is the best of all possible worlds. It is as good as it can be, right? And so there's a certain notion that if one is born into a particular station in life, one should accept their role, because like nothing happens by chance. If you are born a slave, there's a deeper reason for why you are born a slave. And so you can see, right? So one is, when we talk about the immanent criterion, especially this notion of ataraxia, which is again calmness or tranquility or serenity. Let me write the word serenity here. So inner peace. That's one thing. I can attest to that. But to say that you are born a slave, and therefore because the universe is a providential slave, it is good and right and just and proper that you are born a slave. This is now an appeal to a certain kind of a transcendent criterion. I want us to focus on this tension. I want us to see this tension. We'll see in some of the philosophers. We'll cover later down the line a more vivid, a more acute description of this tension. But you know, this is the basic story. It's kind of Stoics in 1 minute. Let's now let's talk in more detail specifically about what the Stoics mean by the natural law and how they understand the natural law. So, in fact, again, natural law can very easily be used on the other side of the coin, and you know, to say that in this quasi-Aristotelian fashion, we have seen the same problem in Aristotle. To flip this around and saying that this universe is as good as it can be. So if some people are slaves, it is the will of Zeus that they be slaves. If women are subordinate and not allowed political participation, then it is the will of Zeus that women be subordinate, right? So again, now in principle, the ideas of natural law could be used and were used to justify emancipation. But also, the ideas of natural law were used throughout the ages to justify, slavery, serfdom, feudal arrangement, etc., etc. So, I want us to see kind of this double-edged, problematic nature of the ideas of the natural law. Thankfully, in future classes, we'll have a chance to discuss these ideas in more detail, because many other philosophers in this course will have something to say about that. Now, let me also say at least one word about the potential alternative to the natural law, right? So, within the course so far, the biggest opponents of the natural law would be the Epicureans, right? And for the Epicureans, this universe is a product of random chance, and gods either don't exist, or even if they do, they very clearly don't care about us. And so, you will remember that justice for the Epicureans simply refers to common interest. Justice simply refers to common interest, right? And there's a certain discomfort and uneasiness for many students who encounter these ideas for the first time. So again, the Epicurean notion would be that when society punishes criminals, it acts not in accordance with some justice with a capital J, but simply in self-defense. So this seems to lower the pretenses of justice. And students are uncomfortable with that. But you know, I would encourage us to try to think this through, right? Because you know, if a view may make us uncomfortable, but who cares? What is important is what are the arguments for this view, right? But on the other hand, so it makes people uncomfortable. But on the other hand, notice that this view can rooting justice in ideas of common interest, as opposed to Stoic conservatism, provides a certain program for reform or maybe even potentially revolution, right? Because if we can see that some laws are very clearly against our interest, then we can try to change these laws, right? So I feel, although again Epicureans were not actually social revolutionaries by and large, they prefer to abstain from politics and again escape into this private ataraxia. But I feel there's a very, to the extent that you could say that slaves and free are not different by nature, and to the extent that you could say that slaves and free both have a certain kind of common interest, you could try to envisage certain ways in which one could abolish slavery. Again, imagine different kinds of institutions. Imagine maybe a vision of progress, right? So, like, in an important sense, this idea of justice being simply a matter of common interest, unlike the ideas of the natural law, that seems to provide a very robust basis, grounding for the ideas of social criticism and social progress. And we'll have an occasion to explore these ideas in much more detail in the coming segments. So in this segment, finally, we're going to talk about religion. Very complicated, controversial, potentially explosive topic. So already in the Stoic philosophy, we see a certain tendency towards what could be considered, traditional religiosity. The Stoics, when they talk about this rational principle of the universe, are very happy to call this rational principle Zeus, or maybe Jupiter in the Roman context. And in general, like on the one hand, in the philosophies of the Hellenistic age, we see this emphasis on techniques, psychological practices of the soul, how the human being can be happy and fulfilled in this life, independently of the vicissitudes of existence, right? How we can guarantee our happiness regardless of what happens around us. But this view runs into certain problems, and one of the recent commentators on the Hellenic heritage, Michel Foucault, actually talks about how later draws our attention to the fact that later Hellenistic schools, or later iterations of the same Hellenistic schools, tend more and more towards religious or quasi-religious mode or style of presentation. So I suppose two immediate concerns that we may have, again, vis-a-vis, for example, the Stoic notions of divinity, is the question of skepticism. Do the gods, or God, do they actually exist? Because, again, it's a strong assumption of the Stoic teaching that this world is governed rationally. However, and again, I suppose vis-a-vis the skepticism, the most important problem is the problem of evil. Again, this notion that this universe or this world is the best of all possible worlds, how can we square it with certain instances of evil, of suffering, which seem to be completely unnecessary, completely arbitrary, right? So, some particular events like defeats in war or, let's say, disease, you could try to attribute to some kind of universal retribution. So a person has sinned, and therefore their descendants now suffer, or maybe the country loses in war. But certain kinds of suffering, imagine, for example, newborn babies dying from some horrible diseases, like extremely virtuous, extremely, at least traditionally pious and virtuous individuals suffering some horrible fate. Again, horrible disease, or maybe horrible fate at the hands of criminals or invaders, right? So it seems to be fairly hard to reconcile this apparent evil with this assumption of the rationality, inherent rationality and justice of the universal cosmic order. And we have already seen how one response to that is simply to deny the premise and to say, look, the universe is not just and it is not rational, at least in this moral sense. It's not just, it's not moral. And so we have to somehow make do with what we can. We have seen this option in the Epicureans. The alternative option is to, so to speak, to double down on the religious element and go all out, right? And you can see how both skepticism, skepticism about possibilities of human reason, and also how this dissatisfaction with the solution to the problem of evil could lead to a properly religious outlook here now associated with the idea of revelation, that it's not just reason, but in addition to that, or over and above that, God or gods can speak directly to humans and to reveal certain truths, which we are then supposed to accept on faith. And these truths maybe are consistent with reason, but they are more than what reason offers. Higher, exemplify higher or deeper insights. Now, in many ways, this is a deeply problematic solution. And once we get to modern European philosophy, and especially the major thinkers we're going to focus on later in the course, Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, Mill, Hegel, Marx, none of them are going to base their political philosophy on religious revelation. So this possibility, by and large, falls out of favor. Now, this is not if this was a class in theology, we could talk more about this. But in general, as a matter of political reality, right? So I teach mostly students of international relations. Direct appeal to, let's say, the Bible in the attempt to solve the political problems of the day is just not really in the cards, empirically speaking. Again, philosophy doesn't trade in knockdown arguments, so who knows, right? And again, theologians will debate this forever, but as a matter of, let's say, national policy or international policy, as a matter of historically established empirical fact, this option falls out of favor big time. But it was on the table, and it was in the cards for large chunks, large periods of human history. So let's talk about them. Now, before we talk about revelation, some specific kinds of revelation, this is a class in philosophy. So we have to take a step back and to ask ourselves, when we talk about revelation, what do we mean? There are many different revelations. And there's absolutely nothing like a consensus on what counts as revelation as opposed to what doesn't count as revelation. So the Egyptians had their prophets, the Persians and the Assyrians had their prophets, the Greeks had their prophets, right? So within our course, within the Western tradition, we're going to look, the three authoritative texts are going to be the Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh, right? The Christian New Testament, and also then the Quran. But one has to remember that outside of the West, there are other traditions. There's the Indian prophetic revelations. There are the Vedas and the Upanishads, right? There are the writings of Jains and of Buddhists. In ancient China, there are the texts of Confucians and Taoists, right? So there's so many different revelations. And on the surface, at least on the surface, very clearly, these revelations say different things. They, at least on the surface, appear to be incompatible. And so, in general, when we talk about prophecy, you could ask two questions. How do you decide between different prophets? Prophets are different. And often, again, at least apparently, they offer mutually exclusive advice, mutually incompatible advice. And secondly, of course, remember Thrasymachus and Callicles. How can we trust the prophets? What is the guarantee that the prophets are actually speaking for the gods and not that, let's say, religion is somehow an ideology that is made by the strong or by the ruling powers to justify their positions. So what is the credibility of a particular prophet? How do we establish the credentials? How can we verify? How can we double check? Thomas Hobbes, later down the line, is going to ask this question. Very important question. Men can be mad. Man can be deceived, right? Men are prone to error. How can you guarantee that this or that particular prophet is actually speaking from the gods? So what is the source of credibility? And, when I talk about differences in prophecy, I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but we have to remember that religious wars are a very common affair in human history between different religions, but also within a single religion. For us, in this course, I suppose the most important religious conflict is going to be the 30 Years' War, which nominally has begun as a conflict between, the reasons for the conflict are many and varied, but nominally the conflict has begun as the clash between Protestants and Catholics. And this conflict led to a death of a quarter to a half of the European population, depending on the particular region. So a quarter to a half of the population dies over the interpretation of a particular document, right? So this is the first problem. Then the second problem that we as philosophers have to keep in mind is that the prophets, credible prophets, maybe if we decide that the prophets themselves were credible, they don't write anything. I mean, Jesus never wrote anything. Muhammad never wrote anything. Buddha never wrote anything, right? So there's a problem of transmission. Somebody, at times much later, sat down and wrote down the alleged words. How can we trust the transmission? Again, let's say if we talk about the Bible, who decides which books should or should not be in the Bible? One of the points of contention between Luther and the Catholic Church is what books do we include? Some of the books Luther wanted to throw out of the Bible because he thought that they were not authoritative. So how can we trust the history of transmission? Not to mention, again, and this is something I've alluded to, even if we can agree on a particular canon, there's a problem of translation, because again, the ancient languages are lost. The Christian New Testament is written in Greek, but it is written in the ancient Koine Greek. Technically speaking, the ancient Koine is a dead language. Nobody speaks it today as a native speaker, right? So we have modern textbooks of Koine Greek, but how can we be sure that the words in our dictionaries mean exactly the same thing that they meant in ancient past? There's obviously a very, examples are numerous, but the Hebrew word alama, does it mean young girl or does it mean virgin? Rivers of blood have been spilled over this question, right? So there are problems of translation, and then there are problems, even if we can agree on how to translate the text, there are problems of interpretation. Maybe there are conflicting passages, or maybe there's the same passage which can be interpreted in different ways. Maybe you could have more literal or more metaphorical interpretations. So all of these, these are the problems that we necessarily have to keep in mind before we begin talking about Revelation. So actually, what we see over and over again in philosophy of religion, in various forms of theology, and in political philosophy proper down the line, is a certain notion that religion has to be somehow grounded in reason. That, in an important sense, there's a certain primacy, with a question mark, always with a question mark, but there's a certain primacy of philosophy vis-a-vis religion. That in order to know what counts, who counts, which people count as prophets, in order to know which books count as authoritative transmission of the prophet's words, in order to understand what is the right translation, what is the right interpretation, you need to have a philosophical argument. And in this sense, again, in order to be, so many theologians over the ages have considered that in order to be a good Christian, a good Jew, or a good Muslim, you first and foremost need to be a good philosopher. And in modern times, basically starting with thinkers such as Hobbes and Locke, in many ways, philosophy will just take the place of religion. That basically, if there are religious truths available through revelation, these need to be independently grounded in some kind of rational account. And maybe there is some place for revealed religion, but it is a subordinate place. So in Hobbes and Locke, for example, the tentative conclusion is going to be that in order to maintain social peace, the church needs to be subordinate to the state, and pretensions of religion have to be bounded, grounded in independent philosophical arguments. So again, primacy of state vis-a-vis the church, primacy of the secular vis-a-vis the religious authority, and primacy of philosophy vis-a-vis revelation. And we're going to talk about this down the line. So even though modern philosophy by and large, modern political philosophy by and large, will be established independently of religious doctrines, or at least independently of the revealed religion, of claims of revealed religion. So maybe it will make use of natural religion, which can be arrived at through philosophy, but not through revelation, or at least not through revelation alone. So again, so even though modern philosophy is by and large independent from religious revelation, however, we need to discuss the views basically of the medieval political philosophy, at least in a broad outline. Now, I have to warn you, in many ways, the ideas that we will be talking about, these ideas are by and large repudiated by later political tradition, by later political philosophical tradition. So in many ways, our discussion of this topic is going to be negative. Still, so let's begin somewhere. So in principle, we would need a separate course. And in fact, among the courses I teach, I do teach a course like this, where we have a chance to sit with students and to read in detail the Vedas, the Upanishads, the Hebrew Bible, the Torah, the Tanakh, right? To read the Christian New Testament and compare the different writings. And I think this is a deeply valuable enterprise. Right? And properly speaking, if one wants to do justice to a topic like this, one would need a whole separate course. So again, things I'm going to say are going to be lamentably, extremely superficial. So I suppose the first thing that we need to understand is that Judaism is not one thing, and Christianity is not one thing. So there's this, again, historical evolution of ideas of particular people, and ideas can be different, right? So you can have different versions of Judaism or different versions of Christianity, between different time periods, or even in the same time period between different adherents of religion. So there are versions, right? So, and I talk about Judaism, Christianity. We could also, in principle, if you want, talk about Islam. Islam and Islamic thinkers actually play a very important role in the history of medieval political philosophy. The Islamic thinkers had huge influence on medieval Christian thinkers, and actually medieval Jewish thinkers as well. So that's again, whole separate discussion, right? So again, Judaism is not one thing. So when we talk about Judaism, I suppose the natural place to start would be to start with the texts. So we have the Torah, which is the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, right? So the Hebrew Bible, Tanakh, and T stands for Torah. And if one were to try to, how would one summarize the Torah? Is this a useful enterprise? Well, again, since this is a class in philosophy and not in theology, I think we can draw on a certain kind of historical scholarship vis-a-vis the Torah and the Hebrew Bible, or again, the Tanakh in general. Let me write Hebrew Bible. The Torah being the first 5 books, the Pentateuch of the Hebrew Bible. So when we talk about the Hebrew Bible, since this is a class in philosophy, I suppose the best place to start would be for us to refer to modern historical scholarship. And according to modern historical scholarship, the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh, is not a single book. It is a library of different books written by different people over the centuries, probably edited also over the centuries, again, by different people at different times, different places, for different purposes. And one should not really expect any simple or straightforward takeaway point or message from such a collection, right? And again, we could go into a lot of detail, potentially we could go into a lot of detail about the particular evolution which appears to be embedded within the different books of the Bible, certain progressions, certain change of opinion maybe, or evolution of ideas within the Bible. However, for our purposes, we have to limit our discussion, and again, mostly I'm trying to get to Christianity. So I suppose the main message of the Torah with respect to early Christians can be summarized in the following way. So in the Torah, we have the God of everything that exists, Yahweh. And this God has a particular relationship. So the God of all has a particular relationship to a group of people who are, I suppose, well, known as the children of Abraham, the Israelites. So he has a particular relationship with the Israelites, a covenant. They are his chosen people. So the exact arrangement, the exact relationship between the Israelites and Yahweh is theologically a complicated matter, but to oversimplify, we could say that, again, there's a certain expectation that under normal circumstances, Yahweh is a good God and will take care of the Israelites. Now, in order to understand where the Christian mindset comes in, we need to look a little bit at the history of what goes on. So, it's a very long story, but to cut a very long story short, at a particular historical point, the state of Israel is established. And there are basically, it exists in its full form only for a very short period of time. There are basically only three kings. Saul, David, and Solomon. Saul, David, and Solomon. So basically only, if you want, for 3 generations. It exists in its fully fledged form. And what happens next is that the state of Israel gets conquered. First by Assyrians, then by Babylonians. And the Babylonians famously destroy the most sacred temple, the temple to Yahweh. Right? So Assyrians, then Babylonians, then Persians. Then after the Persians, the Israelites are conquered by the Greeks and then by the Romans. So there's a certain prima facie mismatch, right? So there's an expectation that Jews or Israelites have a particular relationship to Yahweh, but in reality, they find themselves in a subordinate, unfortunate, deleterious position, right? So this cries out for kind of an explanation. So you could say that, again, from a Christian standpoint, the biggest problem, I guess, facing the Israelites is this, or intellectual problem, is the problem of theodicy. Theodicy. How do we reconcile? So theodicy in Greek means God's justice. So theos means God, dike means justice. So how do we reconcile God's justice with the apparent sufferings of the Israelites? So especially of the presumably innocent and virtuous Israelites. It's again, innocent women and children being raped and slaughtered. How can we reconcile this? So the interpretation that gets more and more traction, and again, I have to remind you that Judaism is not one thing, and even within the Hebrew Bible, you will find apparently different theological solutions to this problem. But again, the one solution that is very relevant and very important for Christianity and for later thought is that somehow there is internal justice in what goes on. So basically, God, Yahweh, is either punishing the Israelites. So this is either a punishment, or maybe their suffering is a test. So it is either a punishment or a test. And so, again, I have to apologize, I'm oversimplifying terribly, but the ultimate idea of this line of argument is that Christianity emerges from a particular kind of Judaism, a particular kind of, let's say, first century Judaism. And this particular kind would be, if you want, Judaism, which is focused on apocalyptic, eschatological ideas. So the notion that somehow this world order is going to be radically transformed. So we're talking about, again, apocalypse, or again, the Greek word eschaton means the end, eschatology. So the world as we know it is going to end very soon. So again, broadly speaking, and we know from historical evidence that there were Jews who, broadly speaking, had this apocalyptic outlook. Not all Jews have this apocalyptic outlook, but there were sections among the Jewish intellectual elite who held this view, especially as a famous sect whose writings actually survive, the Essenes. Their idea was that Yahweh, for a time, for his own reasons, has allowed the forces of evil to triumph in this world, maybe as punishment or as a test. But very soon, what's going to happen is that Yahweh is going to intervene directly, or maybe through his angels, and is going to, judge the people and restore justice and establish, again, a very important phrase, very important for later Christianity, the kingdom of heaven on earth. The kingdom of heaven on earth. And again, the notion that there was this apocalyptic expectation that this is going to happen soon. And again, the implication would be, notice, it's a very important idea here. The implication would be that since, again, all of these conquerors, Assyrians, Babylonians, Persians, Greeks, and Romans, they are directly or indirectly agents of Yahweh. So actually to resist them, to fight against them, to engage in armed rebellion or uprising against them is actually to rebel against Yahweh. So what the righteous Jews are supposed to do, what good Israelites are supposed to do, is they are supposed to suffer, right? And pray to Yahweh, have full faith in Yahweh. And then what's going to happen is some sort of, again, apocalyptic event, maybe a day of judgment. And this is why, incidentally, you also get ideas of resurrection. Again, not exactly life after death, but resurrection of the people who died, right? And this appears, again, in the chronologically later books of the Hebrew Bible. Resurrection and an establishment of this new order, again. So, resurrection, and again, this idea of kingdom of God on earth. In which somehow all of the problems of this world are going to be rectified. So, against this background of our general overview of the main ideas or evolution of Jewish thought, we can talk about the figure of Jesus. So this is obviously a very complicated task and a huge issue in contemporary scholarship. Who was historical Jesus? And I have to warn you that, again, within modern scholarship, there are many different interpretations of who Jesus was and what exactly was his message. And I think it's also very important to remember that, again, Christianity is not one thing. My sociologist friends tell me that today there are 40,000 denominations of Christianity, right? So there are, roughly speaking, 40,000 different ways to understand who Jesus was and what he stood for and how should we read the Bible, and in fact, what books we should put into the Bible. Everything I say has to be taken with a grain of salt. So within this general narrative, it seems fair to suppose, historically speaking, that although this is controversial, as everything is controversial, that Jesus was a kind of an apocalyptic prophet, broadly speaking, analogous to the Essenes I have mentioned in the previous segment. So now, again, this is potentially an endless debate, but there are specific points of the text of the Christian New Testament that we can point to. And there are specific, again, historical reconstructions about the early Christian communities that we can allude to. So more specifically, now, again, talking about Jesus more specifically, first of all, Jesus never wrote anything, as far as we can tell. And in fact, the book of Acts insists that the apostles, the 12, were actually illiterate, and so did not write and could not write anything. And probably, as far as we can tell, Jesus spoke Aramaic, so neither Hebrew nor Greek. And the Christian New Testament is written in Greek. So I suppose I should immediately mention a certain problem with the sources, like not to get bogged down, but our earliest source, but it's important for us to keep in mind, right? Like, how should we approach this as scholars or as philosophers? Our earliest source is probably Paul, who writes maybe around the year 50. And Paul is a problematic source because he did not know Jesus personally. He spoke, he associated with Jesus' disciples, and he had visions of Jesus, but from a historical standpoint, Paul is not a primary source. He did not know Jesus personally. Now, and then, of course, we have the Gospels, right? And the interesting thing about the Gospels is that there are 4 Gospels, not one, and they are written in Greek, not in Aramaic and not in Hebrew. So there's a certain distance, cultural distance, between the literate educators' writings of the Gospels and the Greek-speaking writers of the Gospels and the Aramaic-speaking Jesus. So there's a problem there. The earliest Gospel is supposed to be Mark. Maybe I should write this in quotes because the Gospel is actually anonymous. The name Mark was attached by later church fathers. We have actually no idea who wrote the Gospel. And maybe the Gospel was written around the year 70 or maybe the year 80. So this would put almost 40 years between the death of Jesus and the writing of the Gospel of Mark. And then the 2 other Gospels considered to be authoritative by scholars are Matthew and Luke. And Matthew and Luke actually rely on Mark, as far as we can tell. And again, the proper scholarly way to read the Gospels is to read them side by side and compare what they say. And contemporary scholarship believes that Matthew and Luke used Mark as a source, but also in addition to that, they used a potentially different source, which is known as cryptically Q, which was a sayings gospel, maybe written in Aramaic. So I want you to appreciate problem with establishing the ideas of Jesus. In this sense, when we talk about Socrates, we are on much firmer grounds. We have the writings, for example, of 3 people, Aristophanes, Xenophon, and Plato. All 3 of them knew Socrates personally, and their writings survive more or less directly. Whereas here, again, and also we have these 3 anonymous authors who were later called Mark, Matthew, and Luke. And again, writing decades after Jesus died, potentially never having never seen Jesus personally, and only retelling stories and retelling them in a different language from which Jesus spoke. So, colleagues, I want you to appreciate this very important aspect of polyphony, which is there from the very beginning. Again, Christianity, since its very inception, is not one thing. It is a multitude of different perspectives on Jesus. So, like, in addition to Pauline Christianity, Christianity of Paul, potentially differing Christianities of Mark, of Matthew, and of Luke, in quotation marks, there are also Gospels of John, which is according to historians, even further removed. There are other Gospels. There's the Gospel of Judas, Gospel of Mary, Gospel of Peter. Among these other non-canonical Gospels, which did not end up in the Roman Catholic Bible, the most authoritative and the most interesting for contemporary scholarship is actually the Gospel of Thomas. I'm not even sure. Maybe I should write this on the board with a question mark. So again, Christianity, since its very inception, is not one thing, but many different forms of Christianities, right? And this tendency to proliferate, this tendency to interpret Jesus' message in various ways, like, was always there from the very beginning. So when we talk today about 40,000 denominations, right, this polyphony is actually implicit in the very inception of Christianity. Although, of course, I have to mention that this is not especially true of just Christianity, but all the world religions, as far as we can tell, right, also have different, competing, varying, conflicting sects. So let this serve as a methodological warning, right, for trying to understand what Jesus stood for. And I think it should be a point of humility. It's hard to speak authoritatively about Jesus. However, again, within the story that we have been telling about ancient Judaism, or let's say first century Judaism, the intimation or the implication is that Jesus was a kind of an apocalyptic prophet who, and the main idea, the main message of Jesus was that the end is imminent. The end is imminent. The great judgment is going to happen very soon. Now this surprises many of my students, but again, first of all, we have textual evidence. So if you look at writings of Paul talks to his disciples in the style, in the mode of waiting the second coming of Jesus any second now, any moment within their generation. Now, in the Gospel of Mark, Jesus very explicitly says to his disciples, he says, this generation will not pass away. This generation, presumably the people standing in front of him, will not die before the end will come. And in the Gospel of Matthew, similarly, Jesus talks about how, again, many of his followers will not taste death before this apocalyptic event is going to take place. Now, more specifically, what this apocalyptic event is going to look like, and basically the notion is that there's going to be this angelic figure, the Son of Man, who actually appears in the Hebrew Bible, in the book of Daniel. So there's going to be this angelic figure, the Son of Man, potentially Archangel Gabriel, it's hard to say, and so there's going to be this angelic incursion, and through this angelic incursion, there's going to be great tribulation, maybe great battle between the forces of good and the forces of evil, and Yahweh and his forces are going to triumph. And again, this kingdom of heaven on earth is going to be established, right? And the idea is that nothing matters. Again, the message of early Christians seems to be profoundly apocalyptic and therefore profoundly anti-political. Nothing matters at all. Any second now, there's going to be this apocalyptic event, so the only thing that really matters is that your soul is in order. And more specifically, Jesus, again, who is, as far as we can tell, not trying to establish a new religion. Neither Jesus nor Paul appear to have thought of themselves as establishing new religion, right? They are writing within Judaism, and their message, they're trying to preach the message of Yahweh to everyone, right? Well, especially Paul. With respect to Jesus, it's more complicated, right? But the idea is that we need, what people need is to perform this internal transformation. And Jesus says, especially in the Gospel of Matthew, very explicitly, that he does not want to cancel the Torah. He's not canceling the Torah. He's not abolishing it, but he wants to make it more strict, right? How Torah says, thou shalt not kill, and Jesus says you should not even get angry. Or Torah says you should not commit adultery. Jesus says you should not even lust after a woman in your heart, etc., etc. And again, of course, very famously, the teaching of Jesus of how one should turn the other cheek and love one's enemies. And also, I guess, very importantly, again, there's this notion that one should give away all of one's earthly possessions, that family is not important. Following the message of Jesus, if you want, is more important than your allegiance to your brothers or sisters or fathers or wives. So there's this very deep otherworldly emphasis on internal moral purity. So again, this is very much a philosophy, again, of this expectation of the other world, this judgment, and again, emphasis on internal moral purity. And again, like complete repudiation of any kind of ideas of earthly success or value of earthly success. Again, Jesus talks about the birds of the air and lilies of the field, how one should not care about tomorrow. And again, a very famous statement, again from the Gospel of Luke, that it is easier for a camel to go through the eye of the needle than for a rich man to enter paradise. And again, in many of the other sayings, again, this intimation that Christians should just give away all of their possessions, because these are not important and not valuable for the coming life. And I hope you can see a certain parallel between the message of Christianity and the message of the other Hellenistic schools that we have talked about. Again, this notion that this world is bad, it's not wholly bad for the Christians, because Yahweh is going to come and rectify things. But again, this world is bad, and we should learn to be independent of it, or live independently from it. And again, so this ultimate point is that earthly success in this life is completely unimportant. In fact, it's probably deleterious, because again, pursuit of money and earthly success will simply distract us from the goal of seeking after this spiritual life. So let's write rejection of earthly success. And again, in some of Jesus' more radical sayings, like in the Gospel of Luke, Jesus very explicitly says that people who are laughing, people who are full, people who are rich will suffer, will be punished. Woe to you, says Jesus. He says, blessed are the poor, but woe to you if you are rich. So there's an expectation of this reversal coming any moment now. Okay, so in this segment, I want to talk about a certain tragic contrast that appears if we compare our historical reconstruction of potentially the original message of Jesus to what Roman Christianity becomes approximately 300 years after the death of Jesus, right? I want you to be aware, I want you to feel the huge gap between these two time frames, right? Basically, Jesus is a poor Aramaic-speaking prophet who never writes anything, right? So according to, again, contemporary historical evidence, there's this early Christian movement or sect referred to in the literature as Ebionites, potentially from the Hebrew word evion, which means poor, right? So, and again, especially this emphasis in early Christian communities on giving away all possessions, being poor, this radical sharing within the Christian community, right? Also, this very deep, very important otherworldly direction of early Christianity, that we early Christians expect the second coming, the second coming of Jesus, or in general, this messianic event, they expect any moment now. And especially this notion that this is, we should understand, this is a very radically anti-political stance. This is apolitical and anti-political stance. So again, we don't care about property, we don't care about earthly success. So this is anti-political, or maybe apolitical. And in the same fashion, again, there's this notion that all power comes from God, that we should not resist evil. And in fact, from the standpoint of this messianic upheaval, it doesn't matter whether you're a slave, a man, or a woman, but at the same time, it's important. So even though, like, technically speaking, within Christianity, it doesn't matter if you are Greek or barbarian, Jew or non-Jew, it doesn't matter if you are slave or free, man or woman, but at the same time, again, this inward, moral, anti-political orientation of Christianity would mean that we should not fight against slavery. In fact, again, all power from God, resist not evil. Jesus very famously says, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's. Paul specifically instructs Christians to pay taxes. Paul, at one point in his epistles, returns a runaway slave. So in this anti-political, apolitical move, again, the early Christians seek this internal transformation. They do not seek to transform society. They await this, again, messianic upheaval. And maybe we should say at least a word about what Messiah actually means. So the Greek word Christos, Christ, is a translation of the Hebrew word Messiah, which basically means anointed one. Somebody who has been, again, this is an ancient ritual of pouring an oil over the head of the future king, of the becoming king, right? So the word Messiah, Mashiach, in Hebrew basically means a king, right? And a divinely sanctioned ruler. So Saul, David, and Solomon would be examples of Messiah. And, it is precisely the plight of the Israelites, the fact that Israel doesn't have a kingdom, the fact that Israel doesn't have a king, makes this word so charged. I'm not sure if I should mention this or not, but actually the word Messiah is at one point used to refer to Cyrus the Great, the Persian king, because he allows the Jews to return back to Israel and to rebuild the temple. So again, there's this connotation of the Messiah, in Greek again, Christos, as this divinely sanctioned ruler. And I remind you that, again, as far as we can tell, the official charges on which Jesus was executed was, precisely these four letters, INRI. Jesus Nazareum Rex Iudaeorum. The charge against Jesus appears to have been Rex, king, pretending to be a king. So Romans executing Jesus as a political rebel, right? As somebody who claims to be king. And, some historians try to find maybe a revolutionary interpretation. And, there were no cameras back then, so it's hard to say. And definitely there were, among the Jews, especially the Zealots, the sect of the Zealots, who sought a revolutionary, a violent overthrow of the Roman rule. But again, as far as we can tell from the message, from the reconstructed lifestyle of the Ebionites, they did believe that Jesus was the Christ. Jesus Christ isn't a name, right? Christ is a theological attribution. That Jesus is this divinely sanctioned ruler who is going to preside over this kingdom of heaven, which is going to come imminently, very soon, any second now, right? So this is the vision that we get from historiography. Again, I remind you it's controversial, but this is, again, we tried to have a certain reconstruction of what Socrates was. Now this is a certain historical reconstruction of what Jesus was. Now, huge difference between this and what Christianity becomes, right? So Christianity exists as a small, first of all, early Christians, Ebionites, probably simply considered themselves to be Jews. There's no indication that Jesus or Paul ever wanted to create a new religion, right? But what happens over the years is that Christianity, for historical reasons which we don't have time to go into, begins to differentiate itself from Judaism. And basically, roughly 300 years later, we have this person, Constantine, right? And at the time of Constantine, historians estimate that maybe 5% of the empire is Christian. And it just so happens that Constantine's mother is a Christian. Now, Constantine he's not born into an imperial family. He's a general in an army. And basically, it's a very controversial story, and it's hard for me to remain dispassionate explaining the story. But again, Constantine's own justification in his biographer Eusebius for choosing Christianity is that the Christian God has allowed him to defeat his foes in battle and conquer his way to become the emperor of the Roman Empire. Not exactly the kind of message, especially about turning the other cheek and nonviolence, that we have seen, right? So we can see the contrast between the poor, dispossessed early Christians. It's an important historical event also that around the year 80, Jerusalem is sacked and the temple is destroyed by the Roman generals Titus and Vespasian, right? So these are oppressed and dispossessed communities, right? And here we're talking about, again, the rich, the powerful, the privileged, the Roman emperor, right? So it's hard for me to avoid making this kind of a Marxist remark in general. The ideas of the ruling ideas tend to be the ideas of the ruling class, right? So the message of Jesus gets transformed through the prism of the rulers. It gets domesticated. In this sense, it's hard for me to avoid making this analogy that Romans actually crucified Jesus twice. The first time when they killed him, and the second time when it was the Roman emperor who presided. Again, in 313, Christianity becomes legal in the empire, and in 325, the most important early church council of Nicaea, takes place, and Constantine, the Roman emperor, presides over this council. So matters of doctrine, do we consider Jesus to be merely a Messiah, or is he actually God? Right? How do we interpret the Bible? Which books do we include in the Bible? Right? These matters are now decided by a council of bishops presided by the Roman emperor. And importantly, what happens is that many of these early radical doctrines now apparently, although this is, of course, a theological debate, which is, I'm not going to say impossible to settle, but it's a whole separate theological debate on how to settle these kinds of issues. But apparently, these very radical sayings, if you take them literally, that we have from early Christianity, now tends to be interpreted in terms of allegory or metaphor, right? And also, very importantly, and this is going to be our focus in the next couple segments, also very importantly, now Christianity tends to be interpreted through the prism of Greek philosophy, especially of Plato and Aristotle. And the two figures we're gonna talk about are going to be Augustine, who's writing in the, broadly speaking, very beginning of the Middle Ages, so 4th and 5th century of the Common Era, and Aquinas, who writes towards the end of the Middle Ages in the 13th century, right? But both Augustine and Aquinas, as well as so many other figures, will read the Bible through the prism of Greek philosophy. And you could ask this question: Is this the right interpretation of the message of Jesus, or could it be a misinterpretation of the message of Jesus? And there were Christians throughout the ages, and there are Christians now who would deeply reject this Hellenization of maybe a different, original, potentially different message of the early Christians. Now, before we talk about Augustine and Aquinas, let me just, foreshadowing what's going to happen next, let me note that, of course, while Christianity existed, broadly speaking, within a single fold, first of the Roman Empire, and then within the Western Christendom, and of course, I have to remind you, colleagues, we are talking about the history of Western philosophy, so we're mostly talking only about the Western Europe, Latin-speaking West, right? But there is, throughout the Middle Ages, between Augustine and Aquinas, roughly speaking, there is a certain kind of unity to Christianity. There's a certain kind of intimation. Even though there's constant dissent, people who will be called heretics and who will be actually stamped out, often violently, right? But throughout this period, there is some semblance of unity. There's some semblance of unity that Christianity is one. All of this ends with the Protestant Reformation. And that's why the figure of Luther, to a very large extent, kind of draws this whole history to a close. And Luther first splits Christianity into two, and then, as soon as you have this split, it shatters into a million different pieces. And again, I told you today we have 40,000 denominations of Christianity. And what's going to happen, historically speaking, is that first as a result of the wars, of the terrible, terrible wars of religion, Christians will have to agree to disagree. They will have to agree that theology does not seem to be able to settle the fundamental matters of religion. And so first Christians begin to tolerate one another, and then this opens, later down the line, the door to tolerating other religions. And so gradually, I'm kind of rushing ahead a little bit, but the conclusion of our whole discussion is going to be here in the Middle Ages, we have the flourishing of religious philosophy, but beginning with Luther, this is going to be the dusk of religious philosophy. And again, religious philosophy in our course is going to be superseded by more or less purely secular form of political philosophy, which we'll get to in due course. Alas, time is short, and so lamentably we're going to have to rush through several centuries of the Christian Middle Ages. But as an example, we're going to talk about, again, two figures who stand at the, roughly speaking, at the two extremes of the Middle Ages. Augustine in the 4th and 5th centuries, and Aquinas in the 13th century. So, as always, a brief and superficial presentation, but still. Augustine is a very important philosopher of early Christianity. And again, to continue this discussion of difference between Christianity of Jesus and Christianity in Rome, right? Lamentably, I have to mention this, right? Augustine begins his education as an academic skeptic by reading Cicero, and Augustine's mother is a Christian, but he finds the Christian gospel to be, let's say, intellectually unsophisticated. So Augustine cannot really become a Christian before he goes through a stage. He reads Neoplatonists, and only through the prism of Neoplatonists, first and foremost, presumably Plotinus, he then comes to accept the Christian doctrine. But a big question, how much does Augustine owe to the Bible and how much does he owe to Plato? Anyway, still, sort of within this broad and superficial comparison, Augustine should remind us of Plato, or at least of a certain Neoplatonic version of Plato, with this insistence that politics is a necessary evil. And in general, Augustine's outlook is deeply, deeply pessimistic. Again, this notion that humanity is infected with original sin, with the original sin of Adam. And so human beings are by nature evil. And in fact, Augustine is very adamant that everybody deserves to go to hell because of this original sin. Even the saintliest of saints, even the newborn babies deserve to go to hell. And God, only by his infinite mercy, completely undeservedly decides to save certain people. Now, God's reasons are inscrutable to us, so God is just in the end, but we cannot even predict who's going to be saved because, technically speaking, everybody deserves to go to hell, right? And so, again, so we have original sin, the evil of human nature. And so Augustine, in a move which is actually reminiscent of the sophists, talks maybe of Thrasymachus, he talks about how there is no justice on this earth. And governments, at best, can resemble a band of robbers. Politics is based on coercion, violence, and there is no interesting difference in principle between governments and the band of robbers. Both are based on coercion. At the same time, Augustine, in general, his general attitude to life is that this life, again, is a vale of tears or a welter of sorrow. So again, in this anti-political fashion, Christians have nothing to gain in this life. This life is only a short preparation for judgment and eternal life after death, which is now understood not in terms of the physical resurrection of the body, but in terms of the Neoplatonic immortal soul, right? But still, to the extent that some Christians can find themselves in a position of power and authority, Christians have to exercise this power and authority in harsh and coercive ways. Again, human beings are bad, and so governments, through harsh coercive action, have to try to make them less bad. And this is actually, again, Augustine is a deeply, deeply controversial thinker throughout the rest of the history of Western philosophy, and especially this idea of original sin. Many later philosophers will find this to be a terrible doctrine. And, linked to this also is going to be Augustine's attitude towards heretics, because within the Catholic tradition, Augustine serves as the most important defender of the practice of violent coercion of heretics. Again, this notion that human beings are sinful, so even though technically speaking, people believe with their heart, and in this sense, like, it should be it's theoretically, I guess, impossible to force people into the right kind of belief. However, there is a role for violence and coercion in putting down heresies. And again, Augustine serves as the justification of the centralized imperial power being deployed against Christian monasteries, or again, versions of Christianity which do not subscribe to the Bishop of Rome, to the ideas of the Bishop of Rome, who gradually over time acquires this status as the Pope, status which is not really found in early Christian communities, or for that matter, in the Christian scripture. So maybe to try to illustrate Augustine's position, maybe with a slightly more vivid example. So if you talk about tyranny or tyrants, again, in general, Augustine places very low value on this life. And so in principle, again, all power comes from God. We are not supposed to resist evil. So, and again, all power is from God, so Christians always have to obey. However, if the tyrant forces you to do something completely antithetical to your faith, like, for example, sacrifice to the pagan deities, which incidentally was the original problem that the Roman Empire had with the Christians. Roman Empire in general was very tolerant of many different faiths. Again, this idea of syncretism, let's just add on different gods to the pantheon. However, the Christian refusal to sacrifice to the statue of the emperor, this was seen as political treason. And this is basically why Christians were persecuted, not necessarily for their religious ideas. So again, Augustine would say that Christians always have to submit, but if they are forced to do something which is completely against their faith, then they can only offer a non-violent, passive resistance and accept their just punishment. So basically martyrdom. So the answer to the problem of tyranny in Augustine is martyrdom. You accept the death of the martyr, and you hope that God will reward you in the afterlife. Again, this is Augustine, and although it's very important that Augustine is not Plato, and I think that there are very clear differences between Augustinian worldview and Platonic worldview, even if we talk about the Republic, right? So Plato, or Socrates in Plato's Republic, talks about this intellectual contemplation of the forms, and maybe the form of the good, which seems to be impersonal, right? But in Augustine, we're no longer talking about this form of the good. Now we're talking about a personal God. And so in general, there's a basic compatibility between philosophy and religion in Augustine, but Augustine has this very famous phrase, we do philosophy because faith is seeking understanding. But again, in the skeptical move, reason establishes its own boundaries, reason establishes its own limitation, and we have to refer to revelation to supplement reason. So this is Augustine. And again, I hope you can see Platonic elements in Augustine's doctrine. So rushing through the centuries, now we get to Aquinas. Aristotle's works are actually rediscovered, reintroduced into Europe by way of the Islamic world and by way of Islamic, Arabic, and Jewish commentators on Aristotle. It's a whole separate story, unfortunately, we have to gloss over. But again, you can see Aquinas's attitude to politics and to life in general is very different, right? So whereas, again, Augustine in this somewhat Platonic fashion talks about politics as necessary evil, Aquinas in Aristotelian fashion is going to say that engaging in politics is integral to human flourishing. So Augustine is deeply anti-political, and in Aquinas we see a certain rehabilitation of political life. This is later going to be important for the Republican tradition. Republican in the sense of the word republicanism has different meanings. In this context, we mean the value of political participation in and of itself. So whereas for Augustine has this very radical formulation. He talks about these two cities, the earthly city and the heavenly city. And Augustine basically says you either have to love God and hate yourself, this notion of original sin, or you have to, if you love yourself, then you have to hate God. Augustine is very uncompromising in this sense. Aquinas does not see this as a conflict. He's going to say, look, the task of the good life is to be prosperous, including presumably having some measure of property or maybe luxury. So there's material prosperity and also virtue and excellence of character and salvation of your soul. And there's a possibility of harmony between all three of these at the same time, right? And in general, when Aquinas talks about reason and revelation, Aquinas writes extensively to the Gentiles, mostly meaning Jews and Muslims, but Aquinas imagines, again in this quasi-Aristotelian fashion, which should be reminiscent also of the Stoics, that reason establishes universal norms of morality, that there is a natural law, and this natural law is clear and knowable to all rational human beings, regardless of whether they are Christians or not. And yes, in addition to this natural law, the Yahweh also reveals particular commandments, but first, they do not contradict natural law in any fashion, and in fact, they sort of complete and supplement the natural law. But there is a basis for good and harmonious existence for all peoples, in some sense, regardless of whether they are Christians or not. And again, in Aquinas, there's this deep commitment to the fact that the basic truths of life can be established through reason alone. Now, reason alone or philosophy alone will not get you all the way. And in order to be perfectly virtuous, in order to be perfectly happy, and in order to go to paradise or to heaven after you die, you also need the benefit of revelation. But again, these two work much more together in concert. And again, we asked this question about tyranny and tyrants in Augustine. The only suggestion, the only advice that Augustine gives is accept the death of the martyr. In Aquinas, it's different. Aquinas is going to say that the positive laws of society, if they conflict with the natural laws, then they are no laws at all. Now, Aquinas doesn't have a fully fledged political philosophy, but in general, there is something like an intimation to the right of revolution. Now, we have to be careful. This is probably not the right of individuals to resist the governments, right? Because at the end of the day, all power comes from God. But there's a certain notion that maybe inferior magistrates, maybe not private individuals, but let's say princes, can legitimately resist, even violently resist, a king who has become a tyrant, right? So again, whereas Augustine simply enjoins us to accept our fate, Aquinas actually has a limited defense of, again, right to revolution, violent resistance, overthrow of tyrants. Although it's not really perfectly fleshed out. Now, one last thing I want to mention is that you will remember when we talked about Aristotle, there was a typology of regimes. And again, I think it's a very interesting intellectual exercise for us to look at what was considered the best regime throughout the ages. Now, for Aquinas in the Middle Ages, it's very clear that, of course, the best regime, and again, I remind you, Aquinas is reading Aristotle and is trying to base his philosophy on Aristotle. Aquinas is going to say that the best regime is monarchy, right? And this sounds preposterous to many students, and Aquinas gives some arguments. He says there's only one God, therefore there should be one king, right? But I think there's a deeply, there's a very important intellectual exercise in us looking at what Aquinas is saying. This should teach us a little bit of humility, right? I believe, I don't want to say I believe, but I invite you colleagues to think about the medieval prejudice about monarchy being the best form of government, and also to think of what we today think are the best forms of government. Could it be that future generations will regard our political ideas as preposterous, right? As the ideas people had in the Middle Ages. Now, to be perfectly fair to Aquinas, his idea of the virtuous monarchy is actually closer to Aristotle's mixed regime. Aquinas' own example would be Moses, who rules, Moses in the Hebrew Bible, who rules as a single king, but relying on the counsel of the elders. So there is some intimation of separation of powers, or at least something like checks and balances between the monarch, the aristocratic, the single monarch, the aristocratic assembly of the elders, and then maybe even in some form the democratic representation of the people. So not necessarily monarchy in its pure form, but something closer to a mixed regime. Unfortunately, on this note, we're going to have to finish our extremely brief discussion of these two profound thinkers. However, let me just allude to the fact that we're going to return to these ideas, again, this realist tradition in politics, how human beings are by nature evil in Augustine, and therefore society has to be based on a strong coercive authority, especially in the philosophy of Thomas Hobbes. We'll see something similar. And likewise, a different perspective in Aquinas, especially this notion of natural law, which is knowable through reason and available to all rational human beings. Again, this is an idea we'll return back to, especially in the works of John Locke, who I think quite explicitly borrows many of his ideas from the legacy of Thomas Aquinas. So another issue I want to mention very briefly is, again, this potential conflict between the Christian and the ancient Greek worldview, with a question mark because there are different interpretations of Christianity, obviously. But one specific issue is, again, this idea of sin. You will notice that in our discussion of ancient Greek philosophy, we almost never had an occasion, basically we did not have an occasion, to talk about the ideas of sin. Remember, Socrates talks about how all vice comes from ignorance, right? And in this sense, even though some ancient Greek philosophers at times talked about the free will did not really play any important role in moral philosophy. So, like, at best, the free will could only act as noise, right? There's the right thing to do, and freedom of the will is a certain ability to deviate, but why would you? It's not clear. And again, very clearly, the Stoics, for example, were determinists, believed that everything was predetermined by the laws of natural necessity, and Plato and Aristotle, by and large, don't even discuss the issue of potential freedom of the will from the universal laws of nature, right? And but this is very important for the Christians, right? Well, I mean, at least in certain versions of Christianity. So first and foremost, I would say for philosophers like Augustine, again, there's this notion that an expectation that there's life after death, that there's judgment after death, and that God, the Christian God, will send people for all eternity to either heaven or hell. So preliminarily, as a first pass, obviously it's a very difficult topic, very complicated topic, but as a first pass, the idea is that if the Christian God, for finite transgressions, is going to send people to hell for all eternity, the fault really must lie with the individual. And so we will see how very often Christian writers, like Augustine, for example, will have elaborate conceptions of the free will that allow individuals to be free despite the laws of nature, to be free despite God's will even, somehow find a way to square, to reconcile omnipotence of God and the freedom of individuals to sin. That, God is perfectly good, so everything that is good comes from God, but somehow evil or sin proceeds specifically from the human nature, right? And again, I want us to be aware of this contrast, and most modern philosophers, with notable exceptions, will by and large not talk in these terms. Again, for most modern philosophers, like for the ancients, free will is not going to be politically relevant, although again, we'll talk about the exceptions in more detail, in the sense that we're going to see this sort of progressive, quasi-scientific picture on how morality or politics can be put on secure foundation, right? And again, this, if you want, technocratic, quasi-Platonic, idea or ideal of how through knowledge, right, human beings can be made virtuous, or at least to act in a virtuous, harmonious fashion, right? And sort of one last point I want to make with respect to all this is, again, how for the ancient Greeks, politics and ethics was deeply related, especially for Plato and Aristotle, how living in a good society, or good society in general, produces virtuous individuals, virtuous and happy individuals. Harmonious polis produce harmonious citizens, right? And like the solution to the problem of virtue lies in politics. And again, this is not going to be so for some important Christians, like, again, Augustine. Augustine is going to say, again, this world is a welter of sorrow, a veil of tears. And again, the Augustinian Christian worldview is deeply anti-political, deeply anti-political. Christians should not worry, should not care about the problem of politics, and instead should turn inside, right? Turn their gaze inside, and to, like, the most important struggle of the Christian is against the sin inside of their own soul. And again, this is another crucial difference that we should be aware of. Finally, continuing our rush through the ages, we get to the beginning of the modern world. So in many ways, it is the Renaissance, the Reformation, and the scientific revolution which inaugurate the beginning of modernity in historical terms, but also very importantly in philosophical terms. So if this was a history course, we'd talk much more about this, but I suppose vis-a-vis our last topic, talking about the unity of medieval Christendom, what happens, I suppose the most momentous, the most important event is the Protestant Reformation, again, initiated by Martin Luther. There are important social, economical, even technological factors that lead to the success of the Reformation, printing press among them. But the basic consequence of the Protestant Reformation is the 30 Years' War. So the 30 Years' War was much more than just a religious conflict, but religion definitely played an important role. Again, we're talking about Catholics versus Protestants. It was a tremendously bloody conflict, and again, as I alluded to in the previous sections, in certain portions of Europe, a quarter to a half of the population died due to fighting, but also due to disease and general upheaval caused by this terrible war. And so what happens is that the Christians are forced to agree to disagree, right? And this unity of Christendom is destroyed. And as soon as the Western Latin Christendom is split into two, it then begins to fragment more and more and more. And again, I mentioned this. Today we have maybe 40,000 denominations of Christianity. So there are several aspects of this new modern worldview that I want to focus on. Skepticism, empiricism, materialism, right? So skepticism comes back to the fore, partly because of the new discoveries of the new science of people like Galileo, Kepler, Copernicus, later Newton, right? So this notion that some of the ancient doctrines which were held to be completely indubitable are now called into question. Like, for example, the Earth is no longer considered to be the center of the universe, right? But only a planet orbiting around the sun. Reformation also has a very, very important consequence in terms of skepticism, because again, you see, many Christians hoped that in this fighting, in this horrible war between the Catholics and the Protestants, God would show a sign, that one side would win, or that some people would come and God, through some clear divine sign, would show who is right, perform a miracle, resurrect the dead or something like that. Or maybe Jesus would come in the second coming. And none of this happens. And this also leads to a certain surge of skepticism. And again, think about this for a moment. The new Protestant denominations assert that the Catholic Church has corrupted our understanding of the Bible. But you see, the Protestants themselves, the first generation, were baptized by Catholics. So if Pope is really the Antichrist and Catholic Church is evil, then it means that true Christianity in an important sense is lost and everything is sort of up in the air. Everything is up for grabs. Like, once we begin to doubt the Catholic interpretation of the Bible, then we begin to doubt what kind of books Catholics include in the Bible. How do we translate them? How do we read them? So all of this raises skeptical doubts which are hard to answer. So empiricism, again, this reliance on the senses, reliance on experience, has much more to do with the scientific revolution, but we have to keep it in mind. And then very importantly, again, also associated with the scientific revolution, but also with the rediscovery of the ancient texts of ancient Stoics who were materialists, and ancient Epicureans who were also materialists, right? Again, this notion, materialism in this sense, anti-teleology, that this world is not necessarily governed by Aristotelian purposes, but maybe this world is something like the abyss of the purposeless chaos of matter that the ancient Epicureans thought it to be. So again, so materialism is anti-teleology. So in political terms, we are now talking about the sovereign states and self-conscious individuals. So as opposed to this unity of the Roman Empire and, again, the universal pretensions of the popes in the Middle Ages, the universal ambitions of the Holy Roman Empire, which was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire. It's a separate topic, right? As opposed to this claims to universality, we have an emergence of individual sovereign states. The sovereign comes from the Latin word which means supreme. So states which are supreme within a given territory. And in addition to this, we have the emergence of the self-conscious individuals. Self-conscious individuals. Again, there's some aspect of this that has potentially to do with the emergence of the printing press and emergence of silent reading. Again, in general, Catholicism has this deeply communal aspect. We read the Bible together. We read the Bible aloud. And it is the priest who tells us what is the right reading of the Bible. And in fact, people can pray for one another. People can pray for their loved ones after they died. And this was also incidentally why indulgences, paying money to the church in order to get your sins absolved, made sense in Catholicism. Protestantism, with its skeptical elements, skeptical of the Catholic readings, one of the first major criticisms was the criticism precisely of the institution of selling indulgences, right? Protestants now, people like Luther, again, if this was a class in theology, we'd talk much more about Luther. But for our purposes, the most important doctrine that Luther has is that an individual must read and understand the Bible for themselves. And, if a priest misleads you, it is still your fault and you are still going to hell, right? Catholicism, in this sense, offered much more comfort to the individuals because they were members of the community. And our responsibility to God, in many important respects, was communal. But in Protestantism, it is one-on-one, an individual responsibility before God. You should decide how to read the Bible, which books, again, to include in the Bible, in what priority to read them and how to interpret them, right? And you will be responsible before God. So again, this emergence of sovereign states and self-conscious individuals. So the emergence of the sovereign states and of self-conscious individuals is going to be the new political reality that political thinkers down the line will have to deal with. Let us very briefly, in order to exemplify this new worldview, talk about wonderful Italian philosopher, Niccolo Machiavelli. Now, Machiavelli is actually writing before the Reformation, but I feel that the spirit of his philosophy, to a very large extent, exemplifies the spirit of the age. So, in Machiavelli, we have, if we were to try to summarize Machiavelli as brief as possible, we have this deep commitment to this new anti-teleological, potentially, in the anticipation of this materialistic worldview. This world is not necessarily a good and orderly cosmos. in fact, there's a realization in Machiavelli that this world is full of suffering. It is not the best of all possible worlds. And in fact, like harmony in an important sense is not natural. Social harmony is artificial. You have to work very hard if you want to achieve good results. You cannot just count on the world being good. In a similar fashion, relatedly, there's this idea of anti-Utopianism in Machiavelli, that we are not trying to imagine that people are good, that people are virtuous. We start with an assumption that human beings are self-interested, human beings are self-centered, that human beings are not naturally cooperative. Again, that order and harmony is not natural, but order and harmony is artificial. Again, so individuals are not naturally cooperative. And therefore, that social harmony is artificial in a deep sense. Again, we talked about how for the ancients, there was this notion of virtue, how virtuous societies produce virtuous citizens, who in their turn reinforce virtuous societies. Beginning with Machiavelli, we have this notion that human beings by nature, well, you could say human beings are by nature bad, but Machiavelli probably would not say this. He would say that the world is bad and people do whatever they can to survive. So human beings by nature are not cooperative. And so you need institutions that are going to force potentially antisocial individuals to behave in pro-social ways. And sort of within this new schema, kind of new scientific progressive schema, that there can be a science of politics and we can, again, reformist program, we can change the world for the better. There's also this very important idea of political realism. Again, this, broadly speaking, this acknowledgement that human nature, both individual and social, political, is not cooperative. There is no natural harmony between individuals, but also there is no natural harmony between the states. That, as Hobbes later is going to say, covenants without the swords are but words. Or as Machiavelli says, again, that the important political emotions are love and fear being more important than love. And that the ruler, like politics is a dirty business. The politician has to get his or her hands dirty. And in order to achieve the end of social harmony, we have to often employ the means which are less than palatable, unseemly means, right? And again, Machiavelli is associated, his name is associated with this doctrine that the end justifies the means. And again, many students I talk to have this intuition that somehow this is a deeply, supremely amoral doctrine. That if you say that the end justifies the means, this is somehow an abhorrent conclusion which should be avoided at all cost. But let me ask you, let's keep an open mind, let's ask ourselves, why does Machiavelli say this? I don't think Machiavelli actually tries to somehow justify evil for the sake of evil. No, again, he says that sometimes politicians are forced to employ drastic means in order to achieve social stability, social harmony, peace, security, those kinds of ends. And so Machiavelli would, I think, ask us, if it's not the end that's going to justify the means, what could justify the means? If it's not the end, what is it? Intentions? As the saying goes, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Would you rather have politicians who have good intentions and lead their society to ruin, or would you have shrewd, unscrupulous politicians who employ unseemly means but do, in the end, effectively achieve the means of peace and stability? These are going to be the questions that we're going to have to grapple with in our next segments as we proceed to our discussion of modern political philosophy.